We have two stories again in today's readings, and both are about fathers. First, the gospel parable about a father and his son's wedding banquet. And second, the less familiar story of a father named Jephthah, whose virgin daughter is mourning her virginity before she is going to be offered as a sacrifice by her own father. Let me focus again on the less familiar story. But before that, let me tell you this. Many years ago, when I started doing my doctoral dissertation work on the Old Testament book of Daniel, somebody asked me why I did not choose to specialize on the New Testament instead. I told him it was because there was so much about the Old Testament that I found so difficult to swallow or even read or understand. I found some of these books so violent. They gave me nightmares when I was still a young student in the minor seminary. I wanted really to understand the historical contexts that brought about the composition of these books we call the Old Testament. One of those passages is today's first reading from chapter 11 of the book of Judges, the story of Jephthah and his daughter. To tell you the honest truth, I am not very fond of this book called the book of Judges, which follows immediately after another book I'm not very fond of, the book of Joshua. I find myself reacting when I hear about the violent occupation of Canaan by these tribal intruders from outside. I find myself asking questions like, what did the poor Sihon, the king of the Amorites, or Og, the king of Bashan, do to deserve to be immortalized in the book of Psalms as villains? And their people, what did they do to deserve to be massacred by the Israelites? Since we generally tend to side with the underdogs, of course, we would be sympathetic with the Hebrew slaves who are spoken about, whose story is told in the book of Exodus. They are aspiring for freedom from their Egyptian masters. But then, once you start hearing about these former slaves turning into aggressive warriors, violently occupying lands and slaughtering even women, children, and domestic animals, you can hardly feel any sympathy for them anymore. You begin to react with revulsion and say, my God, but those are human beings too. How can you switch so quickly from being oppressed slaves to behaving like cruel conquerors who are now the oppressors? Well, today's reading, first reading, is one of the most horrible stories in the Old Testament. That is why I thought maybe I should devote some time to it. We hear about a father, Jephthah, who supposedly made a vow, a promise to the Lord. He promised that if the Lord would help him defeat the Ammonite people in battle, he would offer as a sacrifice offering the very first person who would come out of the door of his house to meet him upon his return Grabe, no? What a promise. Unfortunately, for this father, Jephthah, who would come out to greet him upon his victorious return from battle? Who is this girl coming out of the house, playing the tambourines and dancing to rejoice at the victory of Jephthah? Tadan, his only child, his precious daughter. You heard the reading. Yesterday we heard of Gideon having 70 sons. Today we hear of Jephthah having only one child and a daughter at that. But how does this terrible story end? The daughter cooperates with the father, if only to fulfill his vow to the Lord. Di ba kayo kinikilabutan dyan? What a terrible vow. I hope, sisters, you don't make such terrible vows. In Tagalog, the word for vow is panata. Even in the 21st century, we still hear of people who make similar vows, don't we? For example, the vow to perform a bloody act of self-flagellation in public at that. Every year during Holy Week, and some are doing it for 10 years. And they make it as a promise if God would only save his 10-year-old child from illness. Well, at least dito baliktad. Sarili niya yung sinasakripisyo niya. With Jephthah's case, anak niya yung sinakripisyo niya. There is nothing uniquely Pinoy about making all kinds of vows to God, mga panata. Even if God is not asking for them. I call it an unsolicited vow. And it seems to be present in many other cultures as well. Well, we hear of stories in South America about women, virgins, being offered to the gods of volcanoes. Jesus himself is reacting to vows like these. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 to 37, remember what Jesus said? You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, do not make a false oath, but fulfill the vow that you promised to the Lord. And then Jesus' commentary is this, but I say to you, do not swear at all. Ba't ba kailangan pang sabihing sumpaman, mamatay man si ganito o si ganon? The Lord says, just say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. Like the invited guests in the parable of the gospel. They said yes, and they didn't come. Anything more, Jesus says, is from the evil one. I think it was precisely to get rid of morbid practices like these that the author of Genesis wrote about Abraham being told by God to stop. Remember that scene when he was just about to kill his own son, Isaac, Genesis chapter 22, and the angel of the Lord said, stop. Stop. You don't have to do that. And the animal sacrifices like the lambs and turtle doves were supposed to be substitutes for their children. I remember many decades ago, when I was still a student of biblical studies, that year that I spent doing research in the Holy Land, how we encountered this issue of child sacrifice in one of our archaeological trips. And I remember our professor explaining to us that the jars, mga banga, that we were looking at contained petrified bones of infants, of children inside them. They were supposedly a historical proof that child sacrifices were indeed being performed as a religious ritual in Canaan before it was taken over by the tribes of Israel. No wonder we hear of some Old Testament prophets criticizing the exaggerated sacrifices that people were offering in the temple in order to win the favor of God. Kuno. You remember Isaiah chapter 1? God supposedly asked the prophet to confront the people with this question, "What do I care about your sacrifices? I am fed up with your whole burnt rams and the fat of fatlings. In the blood of calves and lambs and goats, I find no pleasure. And when you come before me with all your lavish offerings, who asked these things of you?" Ang gandang Tagalogin. Sino bang humingi sa inyo niyan? One of the most dangerous things about religion is the fanatical tendency to project to God our own ego and to end up doing things that have nothing at all to do with God's will. I would recommend the book of the prophet Micah as another excellent critique to this twisted kind of religious fanaticism. Micah chapter 6, verses 6 to 7, the prophet says, "What offerings will I bring before the Lord and bow before God the Most High? Shall I come before Him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with 1,000 rams, with myriad streams of oil? Will I sacrifice my firstborn child for my sins, the fruit of my body for the crimes that I have committed?" And then comes the punchline on verse 8. "You have been told, O mortal, what is good, and what the Lord is asking of you. Only do justice and love goodness and walk humbly with your God." That's all. Well, there is actually another way of reading the story of Jephthah. One might say he was just being taught a lesson. Kasi ang dali niyang binolunteer na isakripisyo daw whoever came out to meet him after battle. You know why? Because normally, it was the servants or the slaves who had the duty of welcoming the master and washing his feet upon his return. Unfortunately, the daughter came out ahead. Now, would he take back his word? Because his daughter's life was more valuable to him than the lives of his slaves, whom he took for granted as if they were lesser human beings and therefore dispensable? Some people think this way. And they have to be taught a lesson. Oh my goodness. It makes you ask the prophet's question again. Who asked these things of you? You see, sorry, napahaba, huh? Many people are still programmed this way in their religiosity. They think they can only win God's favor or obtain the graces and blessings of God if they make all kinds of unsolicited promises and sacrifices. They don't realize that in doing this, instead of honoring God, they insult God. Instead of worshiping God, they replace God with their own ego. Oh, how many wretched things are done in this world in the name of God. Many things which God never even asked for.